What's up? My name is Ken Dumbo, the MC with the sauce. Don't forget to subscribe to JQ.
And how's Zambia?
Well, I was last year in September of last year, and a lot has changed, to be honest. A lot has changed, I think, in the direction of some aspect of desperation is what I've been observing.
Yeah.
When I left, load shedding wasn't as bad as it is. It is now quite bad. When I left, commodities went as high as they are today. When I left, the price of petrol and diesel and kerosene wasn't as high as where it is today. When I left, and I'm sure there's some things we'll get into, when I left, the price of meal wasn't where it was today. When I left, we hadn't declared a disaster in terms of food, as we have now. So I've come back to
a desperate situation.
Zambia that's not encouraging. That's the unfortunate bit. And since I've been back, I've been sort of talking to people, talking to Baba men, talking to people in marketplaces, talking to people in buses, just trying to get a sense of how they see things.
The country.
And it appears to be a desperate situation, I would
It
say.
It is, without doubt. Before we get to there, you are at the Institute and in the United Arab Emirates. As an academic, apparently there is a Zambian who your institute is interested in. Just tell the country about this man who we don't even know and we don't discuss.
You're right. I mean, I also hadn't heard about him until I went to the UAE, which is incredibly sad. He appears to have been a first-rate economist as well as a first-rate diplomat, much like yourself. So his name is Mr. Ambassador Ephraim Chibwe. He's late now.
Yeah, Isi Chibwe.
Isi Chibwe. So Ambassador Chibwe was introduced to the United Arab Emirates in 1976.
Wow.
Because there was a very big conference that was convened by the ruler of the Emirate of Sharjah. The Emirate of Sharjah is where I live, and Sharjah is part of the United Arab Emirates.
Yeah.
Right? So he convened this major conference on Afro-Arab relations, strengthening Afro-Arab relations in Sharjah in 1976.
Yeah.
And he invited former President Kenneth Kaunda to attend. Many other dignitaries were invited. The conference was organized by Professor Ali Mazrui. I think Zambians know Professor Ali Mazrui from that
his
famous
BBC
documentary, The Africans, A Triple Heritage. So Dr. Kaunda couldn't make that conference, but he instead sent Ambassador Chibwe. At the time, Ambassador Chibwe was ambassador to West Germany, I think, and the European Economic Community, as it was known, then EEC or something like that. So Ambassador Chibwe gave an opening keynote on behalf of Dr. Kaunda. Right? And from there, Ambassador Chibwe then became very interested in Afro-Arab relations.
Yeah.
Being an economist himself, he then subsequently wrote 2 very important books on strengthening Afro-Arab relations, as well as how he called the book Gulf Dollars for Africa. So essentially he was arguing the Gulf has a lot of dollars that it's getting from petrodollars at the time. And how can these dollars help Africa's development? So he was a very interesting thinker in that way. In fact, that book, book on Afro-Arab relations, the foreword was written by the current ruler of Sharjah, Sheikh Sultan bin Al-Qasimi. And so essentially
I hope you guys are organizing a reprint of the book.
When I arrived there and I was a Zambian, they began to ask me about this guy. Do you know this guy? Because they're trying to reprint the lecture that he gave in 1976.
Yes.
They've got the text of it, but what they don't have is his bio. And I think I reached out to you because being a diplomat, I said, Ambassador Mwamba, do you know Ambassador Chibwe? And I think you subsequently spoke to
Yes, of course. He once worked with Dr. Chiluba, he's a former minister.
Okay.
And he was a very famous businessman in Zambia. He owned Isi Milling, which was nationalized by the Kaunda regime. But I think there was later compensation that was done, and the plant was given back to him. There are some family members I spoke to after this program. I can put you in touch, especially for intellectual rights like reprint of the book and the other works that you are interested in.
Correct.
He once worked at Bank of Zambia as a director, then was appointed as ambassador in West Germany. And, as ambassadors, for example, I was ambassador in Ethiopia, but I was also ambassador to other places like Somalia, Djibouti, and the Sudan. Union. And then I was accredited to the African Union and the UNECA, as we call it. So similarly, it looks like Ambassador Chibwe his other jurisdiction were the UAE
Correct.
and other lands.
Correct.
Yeah. So I think we are on firm ground. I'm glad that you are at an institute that are celebrating a Zambian.
Yes.
So your footprints are made, your work is made easier.
Wow, that's true. So one of my boss, Professor Salah, when I told him I was coming to Zambia, he said to me, Grieve, we're going to reprint this text of his speech, but we've got to put together a bio of him, because this is what we do in academia. When somebody presents a paper, a small bio is put at the end there just to tell people who this person is or who this person was.
Yeah.
So I'm very glad that
you
you
will
and
speak
I
to some
are
family
connecting here
members
so that we can,
that will
put
give
together
you
a bio of this distinguished son of this country, and then hopefully we reprint his books.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we reprint many of his other speeches
works,
and texts that he might have given, because by looking at the past, we can understand where we are and also forge a way forward.
Yes,
I think it's
correct.
really important. This is one of the things that we forget in this country, the role of history. Because what we are going through, others have gone through in some version before, and others have had different policy debates and constraints. And what we haven't done very well is to understand the constraints, the debates that they had then, how they resolved them, the forces that they were facing, and how we can sort of shed the light on today. Yeah. So I think I'm glad that there's a link that connects us to Ambassador Chibwe, and we can see what we can do about bringing his work back to life.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. 3 years ago was a momentous period for this country and for Africa. The country was celebrating a free and fair election and the election of President Hakainde Hichilema. 12 days later, on 24th August 2021, he was sworn in as new president. He came as a president that, first of all, will liberate the country. The economy was in crisis at the time. He said he would bring more freedoms to our people, and that was going to be a beacon, of proper democracy for Africa. 3 years later, everything seems to have gone south. Let's start from there.
Yeah, that's when we're recording this conversation on the anniversary, like you said, of the elections in 2021. Yeah. I remember waking up very early myself to go cast my vote alongside many other expectant Zambians. Yeah. And I think, we all know his victory was historic. I don't think, not since President Chilwa in 1991 did we have such a convincing victory by somebody who went into State House.
So Chilwa won by 76%.
76.
He won by over 61%.
Exactly. This is a historic vote and historic endorsement from the people, and I think the people were very expectant. 3 years down the line, I think it's safe to say it has been disappointing. And I think when one gets a sense from talking to people, obviously, one gets a sense from looking at the numbers, as I do as an economist. And I know we'll get into some details, but one of the things that is striking, how do you measure the success of a government, particularly in the line of the economy, which is what I'm an expert in, right? So I look at things like growth, performance of growth. We're a copper producer. Copper is a very important commodity for us. So I look at the production of performance in terms of copper. I look at the performance in terms of agriculture. These are three things, for example, I'll start to look at, and we can go in depth on some other things. If you look at copper, let's start from copper. 2021, I think we produced, this is the last year of the Patriotic Front, we produced northwards of 800,000 metric tons of copper, right? 2022, it went down to 700,000 something metric tons. 2023, below 700,000 metric tons, 600,000 metric tons. And I think this year might even be lower than that, given what's happening with load shedding.
It appears that we're recording probably the lowest in the last 40 years in 2024.
Now, and this is by a government that was telling us that they're going to give tax incentives to the mines so that they can get us to how much? 3 million metric tons of copper by 2030. But actually, we've given these incentives, and the performance is in the opposite direction. So that's one thing, copper. The second thing is maize, agriculture, but maize, which is a very big part of our agriculture sector. 2021, I think we had the last year of the Patriotic Front government, we had 3.6 million metric tons of maize production. 2022, it went down to 2.7 million metric tons of maize. 2023, 1.5 million metric tons of maize production. Again, that's a trend in the opposite direction. Right? These are real things which our farmers are feeling, which our people are feeling, which our miners are feeling. These are real. This is what we mean when we're measuring the success of a government. We look at things that are really relevant to us. Let's look at growth, right? 2021, I think growth was about 6%. But also we are just recovering from COVID, so it was a bounce back from COVID. 2022, it went down to 5%. 2023, it went down to 4% something. This year, Minister Musokotwane just, I think he gave a statement, a revised, remember he started out the year by telling us we're going to grow at 4% this year. And then he's given a revised projection. We're going to end the year at 2.7%, and I think it might even be lower. Yeah. So again, that trend is in the opposite direction. So when I look at some of these things, and one can look at many other indicators, you can look at the inflation rate, you can look at the cost of commodities, you can look at the cost of petrol and diesel, you can look at the exchange rate, you can look at the monetary policy rate at the central bank. Really, when I consider all these things in total, I think the performance is subpar. And I think even much more subpar, given the huge expectations, the huge hopes that the Zambian people entrusted in this government, right? Given the statements and promises the president himself gave, because he sold himself.
Statements, yes.
Yes, he sold himself as an economic manager. And the people believed that. But when I look at the evidence in the way I've just described it to you, Ambassador Mwamba, and I think the audience is actually feeling it. So it's these facts are not sort of fictitious. They're facts that are real. When I present the evidence in this way, it's very difficult for one to come and conclude that on the economy, this government has scored 10 out of 10.
The president, when we present the facts, like you have stakeholders to him and his government, they blame the Patriotic Front. They said they found a mountain of debt, and they didn't find a working program with the IMF, and they said there was no investment, and the economy was in negative, and they say they've succeeded with debt restructure, and there should be optimistic future prospects. What's your reaction when you hear their defense and talk?
Before I come to this, I just forgot one other fact, which is very important. For the first time in possibly, if my math is correct, possibly 20 years, we're going to be a net importer of maize. For the first time in 20 years. Over the last 20 years, we've been a net exporter, which means, Ambassador Mwamba, we've exported more maize than we've imported because we've had sufficient maize domestically. For the first time in 20 years, we're going to look to others to feed us. Right? This really is tragic.
In fact, I think it's the last 30 years. You are being optimistic. So there's been an announcement that government will be importing 650,000 metric tons of maize worth $220 million from Tanzania. And there could be other imports.
Correct. So it's really tragic. It's really tragic. Now, to come to the question you asked me, it is true that the challenges the UPND government inherited were monumental. They were huge challenges. You said it at the beginning. We had a huge debt at the end of 2021. The economy had just gone through COVID in 2020, but also economic growth was on the downswing. The exchange rate was out of whack. But it is these reasons why the people decided to change the manager. And they changed the manager. And any manager is rewarded or assessed on the basis of how they overcome challenges. That is essentially how you assess a manager.
In fact, if he was a coach, would have been fired.
Exactly. That's true.
Because if you find a team on a losing streak, and you are hired to change the fortune and you lose even more, you'll be fired.
Any political party, any government is assessed on the basis of how they did in the face of challenges. This is why we have, for example, people always invoking the name of Levi Mwanawasa, because he inherited huge challenges at the time and turned the things around. In his first 3 years in office, the man was scoring 5, 6, 7% growth. By the time that decade was up, it was 10% growth per annum. So there is a grace period, certainly, when you take over power, where people are giving you the benefit of the doubt, but it's 3 years later. The UPND government has already used up 60% of its 5 years, right? It is 3 years later. And I think we're at a point where we can firmly grade the student. As a professor, this is what I do, right? I would say, okay, you had the assessments during the semester, you had the midterm test, and now you have the exam, and we can assess you properly. And that's exactly what we're doing here. Performing this assessment, Ambassador Mwamba, they have done very badly. And one of the fundamental reasons why they have done very badly is the policy position that they adopted in trying to fix our situation. I said it 3 years ago.
Let's start from there. Let's start from there.
That's true.
Because clearly, all of us understood the challenges.
Correct.
Yet we had the debt, that was stifling growth
Correct.
and social spending. We didn't have the cost of living crisis that we now
Correct.
have
Correct.
to this level. There was an issue of legacy issues,
Correct.
unemployment,
Correct.
disease burden,
Correct.
and just underdevelopment in our, across the country.
Correct.
What could we have done better?
I think
What was wrong with them? Because first they rushed to the IMF. Tell us, you as an economist.
I think so. At the level of ideology,
Yeah.
is where the mistakes began to happen, in my opinion. And then ideology translates into policy. So
Yeah.
what ideology? I see, Ambassador, on your wall, you're always talking about neoliberal policies or neoliberal ideology.
Yeah.
So that was the ideology that the UPND adopted. Although, in my analysis of candidate, when he was candidate, Hakainde Hichilema, I did notice that in the run-up to the elections, his statements tended to move to the center.
Yeah.
So moved a lot away from the far-right neoliberal position of private sector, capitalism, etc., and he began to move very much to the center. I remember, for example, reading his speeches on the mines. He talked a lot about we need to run the mines. I saw that in the run-up to the elections, right? So basically, he knows or he understood that the Zambian people are actually not neoliberals. The Zambian people do not like this unfettered capitalism, unfettered private markets, unfettered accumulation of capital and greed. Zambian people, really, what Zambian people want at the end of the day is, look, what I want is for my children to go to school, to have health care, to get a job. I don't think a Zambian wakes up and saying, I want to live in a society where a few people are phenomenally wealthy and the rest of us are poor. No. Zambians have understood that neoliberalism is not an ideology that takes you anywhere.
Yeah.
And this is why, how do they know this? They have looked at those periods of our history where we have moved away from neoliberalism. Those are the periods in our history when we've had mass prosperity, when we've had broad-based prosperity for everybody. So the mistakes of the UPND government started at the level of ideology. So immediately that they won the election, I do remember, even before the president had constituted his cabinet, he gave an interview to the BBC,
Yeah.
right? And in that interview, he did say, we're going to go to the IMF. And then I realized at that moment, oh, this is mistake number one. Even if it were the case that you want to go in the direction of the IMF, shouldn't you do broad-based consultation first? Right? First of all, constitute the cabinet, allow for some debate, convene an indaba. I think people like you were calling for an indaba. People like Dr. Luwinda Habazoka were calling for an indaba.
Yeah.
Trevor Simumbo were calling for an indaba. Constitute an indaba so that you subject this idea to debate. Right? Even if you want to go the IMF route, subject this idea to debate, but they didn't. So they were elected in August. He gave that interview. His first appointment, cabinet appointment, was Minister Msokotwane, and then the rest is history. By December of that year, of 2021, we had a staff-level agreement with the IMF already in place. The following year, in September of 2022, the executive board of the IMF endorsed that plan. Now, the problem with, and this is where the problem started.
Yeah.
The problem with an IMF plan for recovery is that it makes you much more sicker. You don't recover, precisely because it's predicated on austerity. Austerity is you stop spending. You've got to stop spending.
Suspend projects.
Right? Bring what they call the fiscal deficit in line, so reduce expenditure and reduce it drastically. No new projects, no ambitious projects, right? And really reduce that. And then remove subsidies. This is how the IMF attempts to fix ailing economies. And I don't need to tell this to Zambians because this is what we've tried the last 3 years. And it has created, as it should, pain, mass pain. When you are in a situation like we were in when the UPND government inherited, when the UPND took over government in 2021, they should have tried to do the reverse. Increase expenditure, right? And try to resolve the debt in a different way, right? So they said to us, to resolve the debt, we've got to go the IMF route. That is not entirely true. If you remember, one of our most important creditors, a new kid on the block, was China. In the olden days before China became a big creditor, countries used to have no choice but to go to the IMF, even though it was going to create pain for them. Now, because in the olden days, the only creditors were Western countries, which are IMF aligned. So those Western countries would say, for us to give you debt reprieve, you've got to speak to the IMF so they can tune you up nicely. And then we'll give you the reprieve. And we might ask for something in return. But China was different. China was a new kid on the block. And I think many of us at the time did say, look, China is holding close to 50% of our debt.
Yes.
If not 60% of our debt. Why don't we speak to them on a bilateral basis? Let us get the reprieve from China first. That reprieve will allow us to continue some aspect of expenditure in the economy, because when your economy is sick, you do not suspend expenditure. You're supposed to do the reverse. By the way, that's what the Western countries do. Every time they have a recession, they do what? A stimulus package.
Stimulus
They
package.
spend. They spend their way out of the problem.
I remember the 2008 housing crisis.
Correct.
What Obama, as the new president, do was to bring in billions of expenditure in infrastructure.
A huge, what did they call it? They call it the American Recovery Act or something.
Yeah.
Huge amounts of expenditure that they injected into the economy. That is the only way you can get a sick economy to become better. You do not constrict it by suspending expenditure, removing subsidies on vital inputs like energy, So we did the reverse. And this is why we are where we are here. But we didn't have to do it that way. I think had we gone to China, very early on, played our you are a diplomat, Ambassador Mmembe, you know how diplomacy works.
My argument was that, first of all, China had capacity to give us a debt write-off.
Correct.
Could forgive our debt, could give us, I would give an example of Tazara that was built at a cost of $460 million at the time. Those are billions of dollars now.
Correct.
To date, we have not paid a single way.
It
was a loan, but we haven't paid anything.
There you have it.
I said, China is in a good place, like you are, that we could go to them and on our mutual terms, agree whether it was a restructure, or they could, if our relations are good, even give a total write-off. It's not that it was going to encourage recklessness in us. No. But China recognizes the challenges Africa is going through. They've just been there and they're enjoying prosperity. And they don't find anything wrong with the debt write-off. Eurobond, they can't give you. These are pensioners.
No.
These are individuals. They can't give you a debt write-off.
I suspect, Ambassador Mmembe, had we gone to China and gotten a very good deal, the other creditors would have had no choice but to fall in line. Right? Because 60% of our debt, the person who holds 60% of our debt has given us some reprieve. So if you don't join this train, the train is going to leave you. Right? So I think had we played in economics, we call it game theoretic strategies. You've got to be strategic, even the way you conduct your international relations. Sometimes you have to play off entities against each other. Right? Just the very act of, if there was some information that, Zambia is on the cusp of a deal with China, I think folks in the US might have responded in a different way. So this is the point. I think we were very naive.
Another problem could have been, as soon as he became president, unannounced, we became aware that he had foreign advisors. Brentes Foundation from South Africa, a charity of the Oppenheimers who owned Anglo-American at one time. And then you had the Tony Blair Institute.
Correct.
And people were banding around Rwanda, Ghana, and others as success stories using these foreign advisors. I was livid that with people like you, you are second generation educated Zambians. They're not even among the first ones. So you can imagine we still have the first generation of Zambians that are very qualified.
Correct.
They've worked at World Bank, IMF.
They have the real experience.
The very real experience.
Correct.
And young people like you, who again, studied at Harvard and you've had this experience.
Correct.
Then we have to get foreign advisors.
Correct.
And then no wonder they shepherded us to the IMF. No wonder they shepherded us to cancelling, proper domestic revenue from our mines.
Correct. And first of all, you're right, Ambassador Mmembe. And by the way, even within the public service, the expertise is there.
Yes.
Even within the public service. So forget Grief Chelwa. Just if you had relied a whole lot more on your public servants within government, would be in a listen to them, heard them out. I've got some friends who I talk to have fantastic ideas. I remember before 2021, Ministry of Finance was castigated as saying they are hiding the debt. Do you remember that discourse about, and I came out and I said, the experts at Ministry of Finance can never hide debt. As a matter of fact, the last Minister of Finance in the Lungu government, Dr. Bwalyangandu, went to Parliament and gave several parliamentary statements about the debt. And I said, when the UPND government comes into power and they do their audit, the numbers will be pretty much around the same ballpark. So even, let alone, forget Grief Chelwa, just trusting a lot more of your public servants, I think would be in a different position here. So when you rely so much
You've
on...
said something very important.
Yeah.
In opposition, the UPND used to bandy around, that our foreign debt was 32 billion, 35 billion. And the first statement by the Minister of Finance, Dr. Msokotwane, in Parliament, I think in September or October, we have to look at the debt, was very shocking. He came and said, look, our foreign debt is $11.9 billion. But you were saying it's 35 billion. He says our total public debt is, I think it was around 24 billion.
Correct.
So like you are saying, the numbers remain the same.
Because experts are compiling those numbers. Experts, patriotic Zambians in the public service with many years of experience, they won't cook up this stuff. Those are professionals. Just listening to them, forget those of us on the outside, just listening to those people and asking them to draw up a plan would be in a far better position than we are in today. So one of the reasons why, by the way, there's a long literature, Ambassador Mwamba, studying how, when you bring in foreign advisors, what happens to the country? This literature has concluded overwhelmingly that the situation gets worse.
Wow.
And it makes sense because, first of all, on the face of it, these people do not have to live with the consequences of their careless advice, right? If I give very bad advice to my president, my mother or my grandmother
will be affected.
And they will call me. Can't you see what's happened to the price of this and that? Those guys don't have this feedback. They go back to London, they go back to Johannesburg, and they continue to live in their theoretical world. That's one thing. The second thing is often foreign advice comes with ulterior motives. Often these people are acting at the behest of capital. Right? And there's a long literature that establishes this. You've already mentioned the Bretton Woods Foundation now. I mean, I don't know the actual facts, but it wouldn't be a far cry to conclude that these folks may be acting on behalf of South African capital. The advice that they're giving might be advantaging South African capital in this country. The same thing with Tony Blair. I mean, Tony Blair is not an inconsequential person. Tony Blair is very controversial on many sectors. The Iraqi war, his own advice, the kind of advice he's given across the board. So I think it is not very surprising. And then we also had the IMF. So we've got multiplicity of foreign advice. And then we add the IMF to this. It is not surprising, Ambassador Mwamba, that we are where we are today, to be honest. I think I wouldn't be very surprised. One of the things that shocked me is I thought he would constitute a Council of Economic Advisors. Cyril Ramaphosa in South Africa constituted such a council. And on that council, you can have some foreign experts, you can have some local experts, you can have some public servants, and then let the debates happen. Let us debate at that level. Let me confront Professor Paul Collier of Oxford, who's one of his advisors. I should be able to confront him and say, Professor Collier, this advice you are trying to give my government is going to cause harm for the people that I care for. What's your response? There be rigorous debate, but that doesn't happen. Right? So the foreign experts are coming in, giving their advice, and we can't even engage with them. We can't counter their position. We can't debate with them. So, I mean, this is pretty tragic, to be honest, and it's not surprising that we are in this situation.
I brought out the issue of Tony Blair because there's a book called Broken Vows. This is one of the strongest critique of Tony Blair's period, written by Tam Bauer. It says, Tony Blair, the tragedy of power. How Tony Blair came, he was the youngest prime minister in 1997. He came in at a landslide, He was the youngest to hold office since 1812 with a majority and approval rating of 93%. So he was a very popular leader. And with unprecedented access to more than 180 Whitehall officials, military officers, politicians, Tom Bauer has now uncovered the full story that Tony Blair was mostly a tyrant, actually. And he was highly commercial, and it documents this. Now, I like that book because I read the part when Tony Blair, with his institute, just after he left office, went to Nigeria, and Buhari was the new president. And just after swearing in, Tony Blair was outside trying to introduce the institute. So later, he confesses to the author when they asked him, what did Tony Blair want? What does he want? It's business as usual. He's not coming to help Africa.
No.
Now, we have these people celebrated in our country. Mm-hmm. We have one of you who prides himself as an economist, President Hakainde Hichilema. You mean he's not privy to these views, alternative thoughts?
That's what's
you economists in your circles, what are you saying? It's like when Mwanawasa was president and he attempted to break the law.
Yeah.
They would always remind him, sir, you are a lawyer.
Yeah.
You were president of the Law Association of Zambia. That was held against him. Even President Lungu, that was held against him. Here we have now an economist. We have a cost of living crisis. We seem to have disjointed economic policies. In one breath, we say we want private capital to run the country. On the other, we are buying farms, conflicting things, and the economy is at its worst.
So there are different vintages of economists. Yeah. Economists come in different stripes, right? So President Hichilema, I characterize him as a neoliberal economist. Yeah. So these are economists who believe in the ideology that the best way to grow and develop a country is through the private sector, through the accumulation of private capital, and private sector will lead the way. All that government needs to do is to create a so-called enabling environment and just really stay out of it. And then the economy will magically, grow itself, and then development will happen. I'm not of that stripe. My ideology is very different. So I believe really that the state should be the major driver of society, of the economy, of growth and development. The state should set up industries. The state should set up strategic industries. The state should take up a stake in strategic sectors. The state should set up new types of industries. So the state should be the driver, and the private sector should be following, not the other way around. Right? The state should set the terms of engagement and set the terms of debate. Now, this is not just like an idea in my head. It turns out the facts support my ideology.
Let's speak to the facts,
right?
And that support your ideas.
So, every country that has developed today, that we call, and we actually call developed countries industrialized countries, has had a large state sector. Name them. Even the US, at the time that it was developing, they had a Treasury sector secretary, a Minister of Finance in the 19th century called Alexander Hamilton. He made these kinds of arguments. He made arguments around, we have to protect American industries from British competition. So we have to have protective tariffs. We have to make sure that we encourage our industrialists so that our industrial sectors can grow. The same is the case for the most recent industrializers, South Korea. They've had a very big present state. The state, for example, in South Korea in 1962, there was a debate about how can we turn South Korea into an industrial giant. So one of the sectors that they identified, this is what the state does. It identifies a strategic sector. They said, one sector is car manufacturing. And then somebody said, but it will be very difficult for us to manufacture cars if we don't have a steel plant, because we don't have steel. Actually, South Korea doesn't even have any iron ore deposit. And then the ruler of South Korea at that time, General Park, he said, we shall therefore let us establish a steel-making industry that can feed into the car-making industry. And I think it's called POPSCO. It's one of the biggest steel-making companies in the world. Was established by the state in 1962. By the 1970s, South Korea was exporting cars. This is the role that the state plays. The same is the case for China, which has industrialized right before our eyes, Ambassador Mwamba. Right before our eyes, China has been transformed. In 1980, close to 90% of Chinese were poor. By 2010, that number had gone down to less than 10%. Wow. Right? That is remarkable poverty reduction. But it came off industrial state capitalism, which is what China practices. It's a capitalism, but that is led by the state. The state is a very, very important actor in this case. So this is what distinguishes me from President Hichilema. President Hichilema believes in neoliberalism, except maybe he hasn't gone to look at the facts. Because it's one thing to have an idea, to have an ideology, and ideologies are important. But it's also another thing to go and see what does the ideology actually do for the common person. Now, neoliberalism does make some people rich. Let's not forget that. In any society which practices neoliberalism and as an organizing ideology, some people become very rich. A few elites become very rich. So if you're a neoliberal and you're very wealthy, you're going to become very wealthy in neoliberalism. But it makes the rest of the population poor. Whereas my kind of like state-led capitalism, or like a sort of
I was alarmed, Dr. Chelwa, as at 2021, for the first time in the last 60 years, the mines were in Zambian government hands, the largest mines in this country.
Correct.
KCM was now totally owned by ZCCMI.
Correct.
Ignore the court cases.
Correct. Mopani.
Mopani, there was no issue other than the debt. It was
Correct.
totally 100% owned by ZCCMI. The first pronouncement by the president is that we're going to look for investors.
Correct.
I was very alarmed because the projection of copper and cobalt, which their major producers, KCM and Mopani, was that copper is going to rise and rise. There's even a prediction in the next 5-10 years, it's going to be at $20,000 up to $50,000 per ton.
Correct.
Because there's an energy transition
Correct.
where batteries will be using copper, cobalt, lithium.
Correct.
So it looked very, very strange that we'll be handing over this golden egg-laying chicken that where the prospects were so good.
But if you're a neoliberal, it is not strange. For a neoliberal, it is not strange because remember the neoliberals believe in private sector. And also I'd go so far as to say neoliberals also make very self-serving arguments because private sector is often the private sector in which they have a stake. So it's, right? And you're right, this was a tragedy. Ambassador Mwamba, I was looking at the numbers. Since the time we privatized the mines, up until, say, 2020 or 2021, we had exported $100 billion worth of copper.
$100 billion?
$100 billion worth of copper, if you do the mathematics. Now, I challenge you, Ambassador Mwamba, I challenge the audience to look around our Zambia and see, where is this $100 billion? So one of the biggest challenges we've had with the mines is the issue of tax evasion, tax avoiding, really hiding profits, and therefore not paying any taxes. This has been our biggest struggle. There are multiple reports that showcase this. Multiple entities have done investigations, academics have done investigations. It is very clear that something is not right in the way we are taxing our private mining houses. So the act of taking over those mines was a great act. Now, we disagree with how it was done in some cases, right? We disagree, for example, I disagreed very greatly with the valuation of Mopani, because effectively we paid $1.5 billion for Mopani.
It was overpriced.
It was overpriced, and it was a silly deal whereby we had to, Glencore had to have the first right of refuse. So they
also took over marketing rights.
Marketing rights,
I remember
right?
You criticizing
exactly.
That, yes.
So I really disagree with the method, but I agree with the principle, right? And I hoped, like you, that, okay, the method was bad, but we've got the mine. Is there any way President Hichilema, because this was his bread and butter, restructuring deals, deal structuring, is there any way we can get ourselves out of this bad deal with Glencore, but still hold on to the mine? Why do we need to hold on to the mine? Because if it's in our hands, there's no issue of tax evasion or tax avoidance. It is ours. We now know exactly what is being produced there. We now know exactly what... It's like what happened between 1969 and 1999 when the mines were completely in our hands. You saw the social transformation, socio-economic transformation.
Copper belt was made.
Exactly.
The economy was developed.
Precisely because we own them. When you own them, there's no hiding. You know, I know you've had Ambassador Bob Sichenga on this show. He was an accountant in ZCCM at the time. They knew exactly the production numbers. They knew exactly how much to remit to central government. All these things, right? So this is, I think you're right. It was tragic, but not unusual if you're a neoliberal.
Yeah.
It's important for people to understand this. It is not accidental that our crown jewels were again given back to private investors when we should have really maintained
I've criticized your other economist, my Womulamu or my Makwenyani, Dr. Stumbeko Musokotwane, because I've stated that he's so neoliberal in nature.
Yeah.
Maganda in 2008 introduces as a Minister of Finance for President Monawasa. He says, look, we haven't had any benefits from the mines. I think it's time to review these mining agreements. And he he introduces windfall tax. And for the first time, copper prices were around $2,000, $3,000 at the time of sale. Now copper was now $8,000, $9,000. He says we need to benefit from this windfall tax. And he introduces the windfall tax. And in 2008 alone, we have $600 million earned from the mines for the first time in 20 years. And sadly, there's a political contest when President Mwanawasa dies.
Yeah.
And Maganda is caught up in the friction because he was a competitor to Rupiah Banda. So Maganda is fired.
Yeah.
And who comes in? Dr. Msokotwane. His first point of call was to abolish the windfall tax. And we lost that $600-700 million that we had just earned for the first time in 20 years. Now, in 2021, 12 years later, again, the first Minister of Finance is Dr. Stumbeko Msokotwane. And look at the story. In 2019, our dear sister, Madam Mwanakatwe, introduces that mineral royalty tax, which is non-deductible.
Correct.
In 2019, we earned $1 billion from the mining sector for the first time in 10 years. In 2021, in the year of election, we earned $1.1 billion. And before they changed that, Dr. Msokotwane, when he came in, he made it non-deductible.
Correct.
And our income in 2022 is also good, around $1 billion.
Correct.
But 2023, when mineral royalty is non-deductible, it's deductible.
Correct. Because you deduct what you pay.
Yes.
You deduct it from your revenues.
Yes.
So it's like a crazy, effectively we give them back.
Our earnings from the mines dip.
Of course.
To $300 million. And remember now we have given them tax incentives.
Of course.
We've made the tax deductible. So
correct.
When they buy capital equipment, they'll tell you, look.
Correct.
You actually owe us VAT refunds.
Correct. That's true.
And this is a disaster of neoliberal policy.
But again, and this is a fantastic example of neoliberalism at play, and also a fantastic example of the fact that Minister Msokotwane is a neoliberal. Because under two different governments, for two different political parties, by the way, I would argue the MMD of Maganda and Mwanawasa was a bit different from the MMD of President Chiluba.
Yeah.
I think by the time that Mwanawasa had come into power, the party ideologically had moved from the right towards the center.
To the center, yes.
Right?
Yes.
So, but it's a perfect example with Stumbeko Msokotwane that he is a neoliberal. And therefore it was, again, not surprising. People say surprising. Not surprising that President Hichilema appointed what they call his fellow bedfellow, fellow neoliberal, to be his first Minister of Finance, who is still his Minister of Finance, in spite of the fact of all these other statistics that I gave at the beginning, which shows that economic management hasn't been the best, right? But it is not surprising. You're very right. This is what neoliberalism does. And one of the most interesting things, Ambassador Mwamba, is that when you believe that the state is the mechanism through which you can drive prosperity, the state doesn't need to play these games of saying, we'll give you an incentive, let's hope and pray that you will do this. No, the state just legislates it.
Yeah.
So like you just gave us an example of Minister Margaret Mwanakatwe. We needed to get more taxes from the mines. So what did we do? We introduced a mineral royalty tax.
Yeah.
Minister Ngandu Magande, who in my estimation is one of the best ministers of finance we had. I can't say since independence because that's a long stretch, but he's really up there. He's probably in the top 3. Yeah. Minister Ngandu Magande, may so rest in peace, he introduces windfall tax. Again, you don't need to play games with private sector. When you believe that the state is the mechanism through which you drive prosperity, if you want something, you just legislate it. We need to collect more taxes. You don't say, oh, we're going to give you a tax waiver, and then we hope you increase production, and then we hope we can tax. You don't hope when you believe in the state. You just do it.
These are commercial vouchers.
Of course.
Oh, they have accounts. They would rather spend $200 million on a yacht than invest it in your economy.
I mean, look at what has happened to us. We've given them an incentive, and yet production is going down subsequently. This is exactly the games that private sector plays. So you don't play games with private sector. You set the terms of debate, and they catch up. You tell them, this is where we are going. Then they'll huff and puff, but they fall in line, or they leave. This is very important. And this is exactly how every other economy has developed. Even in the US today, the so-called paragon of capitalism, do you know the stakes that the federal government has in many of these companies? For example, some companies would not exist without the federal government. Yeah. Some companies would not exist without the federal government really pumping in money.
Look at the bailout to save the motor vehicle.
The motor vehicle and the financial sector. Tesla today, which is one of the most valuable companies in the world, the maker of electric cars, without
the
subsidies, Tesla would not be a success story. Even Apple, which we worship today, Apple's very famous thing is they introduced the touch screen technology, the one where we just touch. That was developed by the Department of Defense. So they had to develop the technology. And then they gave it to Apple. GPS, which is the hallmark of phones today, was developed by the Department of Defense. So even in the US, they lie to us. But there too, the state is very much involved, heavily involved in Facebook, heavily involved in Twitter, heavily involved in the financial sector. Last year when Silicon Valley Bank, a bank almost went under? I think you might have read about it.
Yes.
Overnight, the Treasury Department there, the Ministry of Finance in the US, organized a bailout. Overnight. That's the so-called home of survival of the fittest and capitalism. They're actually doing the reverse. Right? So they're saying something else, but actually doing the reverse.
You have to save lives. You have to save jobs.
You've got to save jobs. You've got to solve the economy.
People. Yeah.
The problem with us is when we listen to what they say and we implement what they say, not listening to what they're saying and then looking at the facts and implementing, rather implementing the facts. So this is the problem we have, Ambassador Mwamba.
Sectoral issues. The exchange rate, we've never seen it this volatile since 2021. I know one of the reasons we've probably lost is, first, we've lost income from the mining sector, and it's playing out in the foreign exchange. But the space at the central bank, what do you make of it? They seem to be implementing this harsh monetary, to some extent, archaic policy of wiping out money from the economy. I don't know what banks will use to borrow if you raise these statutory reserves. You actually even mop up government's ministries, have accounts with this commercial bank. They are now implementing what they are calling a zero-based balance. No ministry or state agency should have any money in their account beyond 24 hours. It should be repatriated to the central bank. Despite all these harsh measures, there seems to be no response to the exchange rate. It has actually grown its own mind, and yet there is this stifle in the economy.
We're under the supervision of the IMF, Ambassador Mwamba. We have ceded, to be honest, effectively ceded policy control to Washington, D.C., and this is one of it. Every 6 months, the IMF sends a team, like an inspector, an inspector of schools who goes around inspecting the schools every 6 months. I think you see these press statements the IMF takes out, or the IMF just concluded a staff visit to Zambia. This happened every 6 months now that we've gotten ourselves on this IMF program. So they come to supervise us. And remember, the bedrock is austerity. You have to limit expenditure in all spheres. And this is the effect. So it is, again, why is the central bank doing this? Well, the government of the day has signed an agreement with the IMF, which has some structural benchmarks, one of which is you have to raise interest rates. You have to slow down expenditure. The reason why you got yourselves into a debt problem is that you were careless with expenditure. So we're going to watch you very closely. So this is the result. The central bank is constrained by the IMF position. Because if they do something, which is what the IMF will call unorthodox, in 6 months' time, when those young economists, often they are young, very young, just fresh out of university, when those young economists come to assess the central bank, they will say, oh, you've broken this structural benchmark. Because you've broken this structural benchmark, there is a real risk that Zambia fails, right? So this is what, all these things are not surprising to me, Ambassador Mwamba, and an IMF program. Now, the exchange rate, on the other hand, you're very right, part of it is sort of the monetary policy stance of the central bank, but part of it is like just uncertainty. So the big thing that the UPND government promised to do was to resolve the debt, right? There is some deal. Yeah. But I don't think the markets are convinced about the deal. This is why you see this sort of uncertainty.
The volatility.
The exchange rate is a very good bellwether of how, what they call smart money, how the financial markets see the direction of economic policy in a country. Right? Its volatility and its fluctuation is a response to some uncertainty. Because essentially what's going on there is that when people are not so sure, should we keep dollar balances or keep kwacha balances? Should we keep dollar balances or keep kwacha balances? Should we, if we've invested in Zambia's financial markets, should we be divesting? It's not very clear, right? So I think...
So, and it's playing out with the volatility.
With the
volatility.
volatility. So an exchange rate is a very good bellwether of the behavior, of how the financial markets, how smart money are responding to the direction of policy. Because they can't see it. They can't see the direction of... They can't see where is this going, which is one of the things that the UPND government hasn't done very well. They haven't been able to convince us of the plan. What is the plan beyond debt restructuring? All we've heard is, we fix the debt and everything will fall into place. But I think the financial markets are not convinced by that plan. And therefore you see this volatility in the exchange rate as a response to that.
You touched on the energy sector, the load shedding crisis that we have, one of the worst, I think, again, in the last 60 years. I am concerned with the pronouncement that have been made by the president. It appears he's using this crisis to introduce liberal energy policies. Number one, it appears that they will dismantle and unbundle ZESCO.
That's true.
Because the president says his cabinet has approved and has implemented. I wish he had gone to parliament for that, but it appears he will not. That they will take away the network infrastructure for distribution and transmission, and that they will introduce, this
net metering or something.
The net metering that they are introducing, that anyone can use. First, the infrastructure will be available to all. We don't even know who will run it. And the most valuable asset of ZESCO, I think, is its transmission and distribution infrastructure. Of course, we have the generation infrastructure. So this will go away to some entity, undefined entity.
ZESCO has always been viewed with mouth-watering eyes by foreign financial interests. This is not the first time that the ZESCO debate has come up. In the President Chibwe time, ZESCO was supposed to be on the chopping block, but somehow it survived. Somehow it survived.
Even in 2007, there was both ZESCO and Zanaco.
Correct.
If you remember, President Manawasa, in fact, consolidated ZESCO. Correct. Because there were two entities in the energy. There was Kariba North Bank that was managing the generation capacity, and ZESCO with other power stations. He actually now merged the two companies and made ZESCO Limited. He actually strengthened ZESCO. Correct. But he gave up Zanaco and said, okay, we can sell 51%.
And he also gave it up in a very interesting way.
Yeah, he didn't give it up to total private.
And he also gave it to the right investor. Who was in sync with Zambia's aspirations. He gave it to Rabobank, which is an agricultural bank in a very strong agricultural country, the Netherlands. Now, this is the way you do policy. That was smart. So he didn't give it to any Goldman Sachs or whoever. He gave it to some entity that said, you understand we're trying to use financing to grow agriculture sector. So you come in and take a 51% stake. You're right. So, Ambassador, ZESCO has always been on the chopping block. And it appears they may very well succeed. If you read what they call the Article 4 report that the IMF published in September 2022, when the executive board of the IMF approved our program, you will see the lines on ZESCO. It was there. They'd written in there, ZESCO is a drain on the national fiscus, ZESCO is inefficient, ZESCO overemploys people, so ZESCO should be fixed. They said it that. And essentially what we are seeing, again,
it's as a result of an IMF program. It's not our program.
This is what I'm saying. Like, we are under the supervision of the IMF. This is what we are forgetting. So everything won't be surprising once you begin to see exactly what's going on. I lost my train of thought on ZESCO. Now, yes, on the matter of ZESCO, these falsehoods about ZESCO is inefficient, ZESCO is bloated, ZESCO is a drain on the fiscus. Dr. Mbita Chitala, I don't know if you've had him on this podcast.
No, he hasn't come yet because he was involved in some political program. He said he would come, but he has done a book on it.
He has written a fantastic book on ZESCO because Dr. Chitala was chairperson of the ZESCO board under President Lungu's administration. So he has first-hand experience and first-hand knowledge. he's written a book that dispels this myth. ZESCO, if you compare ZESCO's employment numbers in the region, actually ZESCO underemploys. If you compare it in the region. And then the ZESCO's debts, these debts which have been crippling ZESCO, are the result of what they call
the power purchase agreements.
Power purchase agreements.
Yeah.
It is not you, it's not the everyday person who has a small meter and is tapped onto the ZESCO line. The reason why ZESCO, a lot of the elite in this country have used ZESCO as a cash cow. Power purchase agreements, whereby they sell to ZESCO at, say, 20 cents per kilowatt hour, and then ZESCO sells to you and me
at 3 or 6 cents.
You see, that is a subsidy.
And who covers the subsidy?
That's a subsidy to these rich
So
people.
we are subsidizing these independent power producers.
So is it surprising that ZESCO is in there? So again,
and even with CEC,
yes,
where ZESCO has a bulk supply agreement at very low rates, something like 3 cents.
Exactly.
But then CEC then
makes
sells
a big difference
to the mines and to Congo, this huge difference. Again, it makes these multinationals.
So why can ZESCO sell directly? I guess that's the question that the previous government was trying to ask, right? Why do we have to go through CEC? But exactly, this is a reason why ZESCO finds itself in this financial situation, because the elite in this country have used it as a cash cow. Again, my heart goes out to the people who work there. Most of them are highly qualified, but they're working under very difficult conditions. Dr. Chitala's got the facts.
Yeah.
And as far as I'm aware, nobody has contested those facts. And I've read it, makes incredible sense, filled with statistics, filled with the information. He's made the argument, if you take away this issue of these power purchase agreements, ZESCO is actually very solvent. I was very interested. Is it early this year, or was it late last year? I saw this MD of ZESCO saying, we should celebrate because we have now made a move to dismantle ZESCO's debt. I think you might have seen it in the press. Effectively a bailout again of this elite.
Yeah.
And also, why the hurry to dismantle the debt? It's because, again, when you're in a neoliberal dispensation, Ambassador Mwamba, things like this happen. The wealthy are bailed out, whilst the poor are left to suffer. Right? So something which has also struck me, reading about this Chihuahua farm. Why are we spending $13 million to bail out, or to buy out or whoever Zambif?
I'm glad that you brought this matter up.
And why aren't we giving this money, $13 million? Many of our small to medium enterprise people are struggling with the load shedding. They're struggling with the high fuel prices. We should be instead giving them small grants to carry them over in this very difficult year. That's what every other country does. When you have a difficult situation, you send out grants to your small-scale farmers, small-scale enterprise owners, but you don't bail out the well-off.
These entities, Doc, appears to be very powerful. Before I come to the Chihuahua farm, Zambif had a farm that it bought from Amanita in Mpika. They got traditional land. They planted these palms. Zambif got that farm from Amanita, and they came and sold it to IDC for $16 million. I think I disagreed even then. It was under my government. Okay. Here we are repeating the same issue. We have this Chihuahua farm. Yeah. It doesn't seem to have been making profit. First, it's in the parts of one of our driest areas in our country. Correct. They are near Zambezi River, so they've tried to boost up with irrigation and they put up expensive equipment there. But still more, I think per hectare, that farm can produce properly. And it's about 8,000, and they're only using 2,000 of those hectares. Zambif, we go back to these neoliberal policies. The Commonwealth Development Corporation is now British International Investment Company. Correct. Invested into Zambif $65 million. They got a bond similar to a Euro bond and invested it into Zambif. It was a 10-year bond in 2015. It's maturing at the end of the year. Where will Zambif get $65 million to pay the investor BII?
Correct.
And now for me, when I see Tony Blair at State House, I see the president, I see Zambif as some shares, some partners of the president, business associates, are in Zambif, and then there are this unprofitable farm all of a sudden there's $13 million available to buy it. It's just not, doesn't reek of corruption. But why would government, Dr. Chelo, you need to tell me, we've set up 10 farm blocks.
Yeah, that's true.
Nasanga, Luena, there are 10. We have set aside 1 million hectares of land across the country. Yeah. And these 10 farming blocks are not developed for one reason. In fact, we have these proposals to World Bank, that World Bank, to ramp up our agricultural sector, should give us money so that we can do the roads, the bridges, we can take electricity to these farming blocks, we can put up housing and sheds in there. Then you go to a private farm, a small farm of 8,000 hectares. You have millions at your disposal and spend $13 million.
Again, Ambassador Mwamba, when your ideology is neoliberalism, these things don't become surprising. In neoliberal regimes, the bailouts often accrue to the elite. This is exactly how neoliberal regimes operate. And we are in one. We are in one. We are in a neoliberal regime. The archetypical neoliberal institution is the IMF. So when a government goes to the IMF to seek help, that government has got to be, when that government places its entire hope and aspirations in the IMF, that government has got to be a neoliberal government. So again, this is not surprising. And you are right, that $13 million can go a long way in some of these farming blocks that you're mentioning. As an investment into a small to medium scale farmers who are responsible, Ambassador Mwamba, for the fact that over the last 20 years, we've become self-sufficient in maize. Those are our real heroes and heroines to whom we should be sending this money.
Smallholder farmers.
Those are the people who, the facts are striking. 90% of Zambia's maize is produced by small to medium scale farmers. And the reason why we've gotten to this level of production is, again, because of FISP, right? Which President Mwanawasa introduced in 2002. But those are our real heroes and heroines. These are the people who we should be sending this $13 million to and saying to them, we want you to ramp up production of maize. We want you to ramp up production of this. But again, like I say, things like this are not surprising when you live in a country that's under the yoke of neoliberalism. This is exactly what happens. This is exactly what happens.
The last 60 years, we've gone to the left in our economic policies, we've gone to the right, we've come to the center. What do you think we should be doing? Learning from all these various economic policies that were far left, socialist, almost communist.
Correct.
We came to the center, we went to the far right.
Correct.
We came a bit to the center, and again we are back to the far right.
Correct. You're right. The trick is to borrow the best of every type of ideology. So the first thing, which is ideological but also an empirical fact, is, like I just articulated, if you want to grow and develop, you've got to have a very prominent state. The state has got to be a very big player in the economy, right? At the level of ideas. This is important. Now, how you actualize that will depend on several factors. So you could say, the state, for example, will be responsible for setting up new strategic industries, and then after those industries are mature, they will sell them onto private participants. Or the state will set up these industries and run them forever. So I think the answer to your question, Ambassador Mwamba, is we have a lot of history to learn from. Remarkable progress, mind you, remarkable progress was attained under the time that most people say we went to the far left. Remarkable progress. Me and you are here because of those investments that were made by the so-called leftist government of Kenneth Kaunda. So there's something to learn from that era. What can we learn from that era? Right? We learn that state participation in the economy is very important for reducing inequality, for increasing upward mobility, for generating a middle class.
Yes.
This is important. What can we learn from President Chiluba's...
How did China do it?
Exactly.
Lifting 500,000 people
out of poverty.
500 million, 500 million people.
500 million people. How many Zambias is that? The current population, that is...
we are 20 million. I don't know how many times that is.
That's almost like 50
Just speak
times.
to that. How did China do it?
Exactly. Again, state-led capitalism. In 1970, after Chairman Mao dies in 1976, I think, Deng Xiaoping takes over. And then he says, okay, we've been doing hardcore communism over the last couple of years with Mao. Let's begin to open up slowly. Let's introduce some aspects of markets, some aspects of capitalism, but we're not going to do it in one fell swoop. We're not going to rush. We're going to do it slowly. He actually had this expression. He said, when you're trying to cross the stream, a very violent stream, you don't, which you've never crossed before, you don't just jump in and start. You first of all put your feet in and you feel for the stones. And then you begin to move slowly. So this was Deng Xiaoping's analogy, trying to say, this is exactly how we're going to build a new China. We're going to open up to some aspects of capitalism, but on our own terms, very slowly. We're going to invite foreign investment into China, but into those sectors that we consider ourselves to be strategic. For example, in this country, we should have strategic sectors. We should say the sectors where we have no expertise, where we have no know-how, are these ones. So if you want to invest in Zambia, we want you to invest in those sectors. Not in everything. I don't think, for example, the mines...
Our foreigners are making blocks. They are, rearing chickens. Our foreign investors are opening up shops everywhere.
We should be directing people towards sectors where knowledge-intensive sectors. We want first-class universities. We want investors in those particular areas where we don't have the expertise or the know-how yet or the scale yet. Things like mining, we should be running ourselves. Right? So exactly this is essentially how China did it. Opening up slowly, coordinating themselves. One of the classic features of Chinese foreign direct investment into China are joint ventures. Yeah. In China, KFC, if KFC or McDonald's goes to set up shop in China, they've got to, by law, have a local partner. And that partner will have 51% stake.
Wow. And that's how they've made the billionaires.
Of course.
Overnight.
Importantly, transfer of know-how. Yeah. Okay, now you set up, I will learn how you do commerce. Oh, this is how you run a restaurant business. This is how you set up the HR system. This is how you set up the accounting system. Or this is how you do strategy. And then that then is transmitted into the rest of the Chinese economy. So forget the billionaires, the know-how.
Yeah.
So in China, if you're trying to set up, you always have to have a local partner. Right?
With a majority stake.
With a majority stake. Take it or leave it, McDonald's or KFC. If you don't want it, go away.
Well, they wouldn't go looking at that population exactly. Of 1.3 billion
so
people.
We too should do a similar exercise where we figure out which sectors do we have leverage. We may not have population as a lever, but we may have some things as a lever. Maybe it is our fertile soils, maybe it is our minerals, maybe it is something else. In those sectors, we say joint venture. But also we have to be very careful that it's not the same people who are now, it's Grief Cholo who's always doing joint ventures. Yeah. We have to make sure we monitor, which is what China does. We've got to make sure that it's not the same billionaire who's showing up on every board of every same company. But this is, so the point I'm trying to make, Ambassador Mwamba, is that our history is replete with lessons.
Yeah.
Right? There are some positive things that came from the President Chilwa regime. Right? Some efficiencies were introduced. In the transport sector, some efficiencies were introduced. In the retail sector, some efficiencies were introduced. So we can say there are some sectors where we can allow the market to operate. There are some sectors where we cannot allow the market to operate. Perhaps healthcare, perhaps education, that kind of thing. So basically we should not be ideologues. We should study our history, the lessons there of what worked and what didn't work. There was inefficiencies under the counter regime. Right? There may not have been theft of the type where people enrich their own pockets, but there were some aspects of efficiencies. How can we introduce incentives in such a way that those inefficiencies don't rear their ugly heads? So this is the point. We need to study our history. We need to learn from our history. We need to craft. So when we're having a discussion about policy, should we go back to the IMF or not? One of the things that should have been debated is what was the previous experience?
So with IMF, it was horrible.
Yeah. If we had
our last experience with IMF in the 90s is that, look, we had 325 companies that were state-owned enterprises. And by the end of the IMF program, we only had a few. And the lucrative ones, like Chilanga Cement, Zambia Sugar, were snapped up by these big multinationals. And we lost our industrial and manufacturing base. In fact, our unemployment levels desperate unemployment arise from that industry.
You're right.
Industrial sector that died.
Deindustrialization. The deindustrialization. You're very right. So if we had a big Indaba, if the president was really committed to genuinely trying to figure out what do we need to do to get ourselves out of this problem, he would have convened an Indaba. That's one of the, I believe, one of the awesome aspects of being a president. You can convene people, and even for free. You can convene people for free.
They can come, yes.
And they will come. I mean, there's no greater phone call that one receives than the one that says, you are needed
by the president,
to give your opinion on this issue. So had he convened an Indaba, made up of different aspects of Zambian society, not just the experts, not just the economists, the clergy, the women, the youth, the experts, the trade unions, etc., and then we have a debate. I believe we would have gotten out of that process a much better policy direction.
Doc, I've never seen you emotional, angry on Twitter, but I did. This relates to this matter that I want to raise. In February 2024, Minister of Finance and National Planning, Dr. Stumbeko Msokotwane, announced that the Ministry of Finance and the Zambia Statistics Agency will establish an evidence lab, and it will be based at the Ministry of Finance. Nothing wrong with that. I think we all ignored that. Then we saw an economist, Sharuk Wan, who's based at Oxford University, announce that he's been appointed as country manager and that he was actually now recruiting people to be based at Ministry of Finance because he had set up this lab right in the heart of Ministry of Finance. He said, we are expanding our partnership with the government of Zambia and you can be part of it. We are building an evidence lab in the heart of Ministry of Finance, a team of economists and data engineers connecting data with policy, and he had one role, and he says he was going to get more people. And he says he's seeking experienced economists to lead the labs day to day. Now, this advert was not in Zambia. It was in London, in London newspapers and on his own Twitter. You responded with an angry tweet. Let's speak to that.
I mean, I was completely bothered and completely flabbergasted. Now, I expected it again. We're in a neoliberal dispensation, so this thing should not be surprising. But
what were the principles that were being breached?
So basically, there's a lot of things going on here which is wrong. Now, we're not saying that as a nation we should not get advice from others. We should say we live in a global village with similar problems, similar experiences. So there's something that we can learn from others. We're not saying we should not get advice. But honestly, to set up a unit to dispense advice right in the heart of our fiscus goes against every conception of sovereignty that one can think about. It is an indignity to have, and by the way, these will be very young boys and girls who will come here, set up office in our Ministry of Finance, and begin to have access to sensitive information, begin to influence policy, begin to burden our already burdened public servants in their request for useless information. Because this is what these young boys and girls do. They're going to come there and say, I want this report, want this. They're going to trouble the assistant directors, somebody who's engaged in real battles. They're going to trouble them for this kind of information. So it's an indignity at that level. But also importantly, in terms of empirics, in those countries where these kinds of units have been set up, what has happened? Have those countries been transformed into heaven on earth? No. If anything, they've now been wrecked with massive confusion and their situations have gotten worse. So not only is it an indignity in the way that I've illustrated, the outcomes are not even worth any water.
They are an irritation. Other than
so
that,
this is what really upset me.
They are destroying our sovereignty and our independence, literally.
By being embedded in the Ministry of Finance. Picture this, Ambassador Mwamba. You know, you have traveled widely. You have engaged with governments across the world. The Treasury Department in the US, His Majesty's Treasury in Britain, and anywhere else would never allow a non-citizen to have that kind of privileged access.
Yes, yes.
forget the Ministry of Defense. The most important ministry in any country is the Treasury.
Yeah, yeah.
Because without the
Even
Treasury...
on the cabinet charter, it shows the ranking.
That's the most important thing. It is the Treasury. It is your fiscus, where your money is kept, where your policy is about money, your policy is about the direction of the economy. What should we do? Should we do this or that? That is the Ministry of Finance. This is why the Minister of Finance is one of the most important people in this country.
Yeah,
he or she can decide on their own to take out a debt on behalf of the Zambian people. And that is where we're going to plant some foreign nationals who we don't know who they are. We have no idea who they are working on behalf. We don't know. I mean, this is crazy. Will they have concept of security clearance? I think it's a concept that applies to citizens, non-citizens.
So
that's crazy. I mean, I was very upset.
At the friend of mine, and he came on my page.
Yes.
When I saw your Twitter expanded, and I called it a scandal. Yeah. So one of the economists, Henry Mono, is once worked for the International Growth Center. And there's International Growth Center Zambia.
Correct.
And he went to Oxford and he worked for this IGC that is now going to be embedded at Ministry of Finance. And he attempted to demonstrate to me that they've always been there the last 10 years. I says, no. The announcement by the minister is very clear. The announcement by the country manager is totally different.
Correct.
This is our new evidence lab.
Embedded within.
And that's why they brought in even Zambia Statistics Agency.
Of course.
The intrusion is at a new level.
No, this is a new level. It's an intimate intrusion. Yeah. I know Ephraim Mono very well.
Yeah.
He's a friend of mine. And he's being fast and loose with the facts. IGC have always had a country office here. Yeah. Now, but they've never been embedded within the fiscus. This is new. They've always had a country office that was proffering at arm's length, giving advice. And yes, you can give advice, but reserve the right to say, yes, we'll do this, and no, we won't do that. Funny enough, you say, when Ephraim Mono reached out to you, another friend of mine who also has worked with IGC, whose name I won't reveal, reached out to me. Yeah. And he said to me, Grief, during the PF days, IGC tried to set up this evidence lab, but they were always denied by the PF government. And they were so frustrated that they even considered divesting out of Zambia. So we've gone completely full circle now. Yeah. So, yes, we should have people coming to give advice. That is
the same argument with AFRICOM, that Americans have always been here. Why are we creating a fuss? Of course, we are creating a fuss. Is that now they're opening a combatant units office in our country.
Of course.
Our relations and, defense cooperation was at embassy country level.
Of course. Like
not
any,
like any other
country has, as I understand, you're the
diplomat.
So
it's the same argument that they are now putting here.
Yes, exactly.
IGC had a country office, but they were never embedded
in
here. The Americans were here, but they were never embedded in our systems.
Of course.
You are now finding them regularly at ZICTA. You're finding them. They are now regular at Ministry of Defense. You're finding them, within, embedded right inside our defense forces. So it's a matter of concern in these issues
now, I want
of
to ask
sovereignty.
The question, with this IGC story, why do they need to be in the Ministry of Finance?
Yeah.
I mean, why do they so desperately need to be in the Ministry of Finance? Why can't they do their things outside? It tells you there's something that they're after.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, this is what is completely worrying. We're a sovereign nation. We're 60 years old this year. The reason why our forefathers and mothers fought for independence was so that we could have the right to self-determination, to determine our destiny ourselves.
And our own policies.
And our own policies. Yes, we're going to listen to our friends. Just like, I'm at my age. Yes, I listen to my parents.
Yeah.
But I also reserve the right to think about their advice and say, what has my father and mother said here? Look, I think I've considered it, but I'm not going to do it. Right? Similarly, this is how we should be conducting our affairs. Let us get
Doc,
the advice.
I have said in no uncertain terms that President Hakainde Hichilema has compromised our sovereignty. And I give these examples. The establishment of AFRICOM, the establishment of these foreign advisors right at State House.
Correct. This is
right
troubling.
at the heart of power of our country.
Troubling. Correct.
And stuff like the IGC,
Yeah,
where now
correct.
they are embedded, and they're even celebrating in London.
Correct.
That for the first time we are right
in the
at
heart
the
of this
Ministry
country.
of Finance in Africa.
This is a ministry that, obviously, yes, the mines are, nominally under the Ministry of Mines, but effectively it's the Ministry of Finance.
Yeah.
That in many
That's
ways,
where tax policy
and
ZRA is
investment
done from.
policy, and all these kinds of things. This is the ministry that handles these kinds of things for us. It is that ministry where we are now embedding foreign nationals to be present. Again, I ask myself, why do they need to be there? Why can't they be outside?
Yeah.
Why do they need to be inside there? And I mean, my heart goes out to my friends who work in the ministry, because now this must be irritation to them. Not only is it indignifying, because what it does suggest is that we don't have the expertise to figure these things out, which is not true. Go and do an audit of some of the qualifications of the people in the Ministry of Finance.
Oh, very qualified.
Very qualified, eminently qualified people. The central bank, eminently qualified people. But they've got to work in this constraint where they're infantilized like children like this, where they're told, you don't know, but now some boys and girls, because that's what they are.
You've insisted on that, because you've met them anyway.
I've interacted with some of these. They're boys and girls with no real life experience, Ambassador Mmembe. What they do know is some theoretical stuff, and that's fine. But often what makes for a very good expert is theory married with experience.
Yeah.
Right? And especially if you're also personally invested, you're a Zambian. You know, if I make a mistake in terms of policy, my relations will suffer. My people will suffer. These people, these young boys and girls, like all this kind of stuff. They're just going to come here,
Just looking at the
run their
numbers and statistics,
experiments, cause chaos, write a best-selling book at the end of it all. My time in Zambia, we learned that when you do these policies, you create poverty. Then they win a nice big prize, and their lives go on, whilst they've created misery here.
Who would have lost lives?
Would have lost lives, created
Would have been
misery
made poor.
We are 60 years old. We have enough experts around the world, domestically, abroad. And I'm in many WhatsApp groups where people come up with fantastic suggestions. Experts. And all they are asking for is audience. I've been trying to sell these ideas to the powers that be, but they won't listen to me. Tony Blair can just arrive at the airport straight.
Paid stays at Pamoza and Intercontinental.
And then he walks straight into State House and presents his proposal. Walks straight into Ministry of Finance, presents his proposal. The rest of us have to, we have to line up like it's not our country. So I think this is the reason why I was very emotional about it.
No, I've not seen an angry tweet like the one you put out.
I mean, we didn't.
I was equally livid.
Of course, you've got to be livid. If you're a patriot, you've got to be livid. I mean, there's so many implications that embedding of a unit, there's so many things that it's saying. That
it violates the principles that are violated.
The moral aspects that are violated, the infantilization of people working in the ministry. I mean, you're now subjecting them to be answering to young boys and girls who know nothing. And also we don't know the ulterior motives of some of the
that
people
information they collect. For what? Doc, I can keep you here long. And the pleasure that you're in our studio, and we can go on forever. But let's begin to wind up. Education sector seems to be one of our key problems. It doesn't seem to produce graduates that can fit in our economy. It doesn't seem to, in fact, our education system appears to contribute to the unemployment crisis. Because every year, it churns out people that have no jobs. Just speak to that.
Yeah, I think the tragedy of our education system is a tragedy of lack of funding, right? Education is a public good. And the benefits of education accrue far beyond just the university itself or the people who are trained. They accrue to the country, right? Many people who are running affairs in this country today were educated public institutions and public education. So the tragedy in education today is a tragedy of lack of funding. Our universities are not being very well funded. In fact, this is one of the things that breaks my heart about the UPND administration. I thought they would come in and fund the universities, and fund the university sector, and fund higher education, and fund research and development. But they have done none of that. I think the University of Zambia still has its cash problems. Copbelt University still has its cash problems. Just the other day, I did see, I don't know if it was Copbelt University lecturers or UNZA lecturers were threatening to go on strike.
University of Zambia lecturers.
Right? So the crisis of our education system, Ambassador Mwamba, is a crisis of lack of funding. Anywhere in the world, where I am in the UAE, my university is funded by the state. They don't bat an eye. They don't blink. We give them a budget every year, and they release the money. Because they realize education is incredibly vital.
And it's non-compromising.
You cannot compromise it to economic transformation. This is why when the Kaunda and their generation took over, the first thing they tried to do is to build a university, because they realize this. You can't talk about economic management, you can't talk about innovation, you can't talk about development, about health, about whatever without education. So education is really a bedrock. We should be funding it, and we're not funding it in this country.
And the curriculum?
Now, the curriculum issues, there I'm less certain than you are. I don't think it's the fact that we're churning out graduates, because really, the graduates we should be churning out, we should be finding employment for them. That's why, again, if you have the ideology of the state, this will make sense. Our fathers and mothers, all these people who are running the show today were telling us, I just graduated and the car was waiting to take me to the company. Exactly. We should not be expecting people who are 22 years old, 23 years old to be starting companies, Ambassador Mwamba. These people ought to be employed. We've got a responsibility to create jobs for them. Subsequently, they will become businessmen, businesswomen, inventors, scientists, etc. But it is our responsibility to educate them and then create employment for them. Subsequently, yes, they'll transform into other things. So I think we're being very unfair, because this generation, the generation that's running Zambia today, had it easy.
And then they're telling these kids to be entrepreneurs.
Can you be an entrepreneur at 22 years old? With what money? The Zuckerbergs of this world are the exceptions. And by the way, like I have said, in the US federal government pumps money directly or indirectly into those companies that appear success stories. Right? Now, if you're a 22-year-old, 23-year-old Zambian boy or girl, a Zambian young man or woman who's just finished university, where is the funding to first of all start this business? So I think we're being a bit unfair. The curriculum is just right.
Okay.
The curriculum is just
right.
We
should create the jobs.
We should create the jobs. We should
create the industries.
Create the industries so that it becomes a virtuous cycle. Right? We create the industries, these young people get into the industries, they get the skills, they open up, they then set up businesses themselves. And then the story goes on forever. We should create the jobs. We should fund higher education properly so that our lecturers are well motivated. They can teach, introduce new concepts into the classroom, then research. And that research translates into innovation. Innovation then drives growth and development. This is what we don't do here. We've got perennial problems of cholera. Where if we have research and development being funded, we could figure out, is there a way we could, is there something we could come up with which could act as some type of antidote to this problem? Agriculture. What are the new varieties? What are the new breeds of maize that we need to develop to be able to continue growing our agriculture sector? The mining sector, similarly. How do we add value? Right? How do we make sure that we're not exporting raw copper, but exporting, derivatives of it? So essentially, this is exactly the function of a government. We need to fund our higher education sector and fund it to the hilt, because that's what drives growth and development. And we haven't done a very good job of doing that. So there's no innovation coming out of our university, not because our lecturers are not great. No, they just don't have research money. In South Africa, where I was, is a National Research Foundation. It spends billions, hundreds of millions of rands, if not billions of rands per year in funding research. In the US, they've got the National Science Foundation. It spends billions of dollars per annum funding research. In the UAE, where I am, they've got their own National Research Foundation. This is on top of the grant that goes to universities. And then academics compete.
Yeah, like you were stating that some of the best innovation comes from the public sector. You talked of GPS, that was an initiative of the military, which is public.
Yeah, Department of Defense. GPS, touchscreen technology, exactly, aspects of the internet might have come from public funding. Again, the state needs to set the terms of debate and terms of engagement and the direction, and then the private sector follows. But here we're doing the reverse. We're hoping private sector takes us to the promised land. They can't. The incentives are completely out of whack with how exactly. So this is my view on the education sector.
Yeah.
It's an issue of funding, and we're doing the young people a disservice, expecting them. Honestly, Ambassador Mmembe, when you were 22, what company were you going to set up?
None. Even if you did, you'd fail.
You'd fail.
Because as soon as you have money,
Yes.
you are thinking of a new suit or a new car. The priorities are totally different.
So you need to be under the
22.
tutelage of somebody else. They show you the ropes. Or, this is how you respond to a memo. There's a meeting, and in a meeting, this is how you conduct yourself. That takes time. So you've done the theoretical learning at school, which is important. Gives you the framework, but now you're now taking to real experience. Like a long internship, and then you can become whatever you want to become. Not to expect that we're being unfair. We think our young people are the ones who are going to deliver us. We're being very unfair as the adults. We've got to create jobs for them and create that future for them. Yeah. That's how I see it.
Okay.
Yeah.
We've just reviewed the UPND economic policies, and it's clearly a disaster, although you haven't spelled it as sad. Do you think they'll recover? Yeah. Do you think they'll recover in the next 2 years? With the measures they've deployed so far, to the crisis that already now is known, do you see them recover in the next 2 years?
Not at all. Not at all. In fact, 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, 3 years in December, this December, I was on Radio Phoenix. I did an interview there I was on Hot FM, I beg your pardon. And the interviewer asked me the question, what do you foresee in the next 3 years, Dr. Chibwe? And I said, I see massive pain. Now, I'm not a fortune teller. No, it is just that I know what the IMF does because I've studied it.
You said that in 2021.
Yes, I know what they do in December of 2021. And I see in 3 years' time, massive pain. And exactly this is where we are. So for as long as we're on an IMF program, Ambassador Mmembe, forget a recovery before 2026.
What should we do in the absence of the IMF? It appears a blanket has been painted that you can't do without the IMF.
It appears...
I say so.
Yeah.
Look at Kenya.
Yeah.
The president ran a wonderful campaign.
Correct.
Bottom up. Correct. And he prescribed these wonderful policies,
Correct.
how he was going to carry everyone
Correct.
on. The first thing he did was an IMF program. Yeah. And all those promises appear broken.
Of course. That's
and now for him, he has civil unrest on his doorstep.
Correct. And that's a real pity that the IMF can build a wedge in between you and your people, between the leader and his people. There you have got an example of William Ruto, very popular with young people, voted into by young people who were expectant. And then he made the fatal mistake of doing what? Going to seek advice from the IMF. The IMF gave him advice.
They removed subsidies.
They introduced new taxes.
Yeah, and introduced more taxes.
And you saw what happened there. And all of a sudden, William Ruto is no longer looking like the president who had sort of like who was carrying the hopes and aspirations of the next generation. So this is again the same thing with President Hichilema. Lots of young people came out to vote for this man. I remember in the run-up, a few days before election, I had gone to one of the local grocery stores. And there was a young lady working on the cash register. And then we talked a little bit about the election. And she said, Doc, I want to vote for change because I am trained in hospitality or something. I've got a certificate in hospitality. But here I am working in a cash register business. So I'm hopeful that when I cast my vote, things will change. I have a feeling that a great many of those young people are incredibly disappointed. So, Ambassador Mmembe, I don't think if we're still on the IMF, if the IMF is still coming, again, remember, they come every 6 months to see how the people is behaving, right? They come every 6 months. If this will carry on up until 2026, I don't see how we can turn this around because, like I said, the IMF policy is predicated on austerity, which tells you to do the reverse of what you need to be doing when you want to rescue the economy. What our friends do in the West, they spend. Mm-hmm. When you go around town now, people are saying there's no money in circulation. Yeah. I think you keep hearing that kind of and in fact, since I've been back, I've gone to 1 or 2 pubs and I find they're empty. Right?
Shopping malls are empty. The car parks are empty.
The car parks are empty. And those are may not be scientific statistics, but they tell you something, that something is quite amiss. So I really don't think, Ambassador Mwamba, that if we're still in the IMF, if we're still under the tutelage of the IMF, that we can turn things around in the next year or two, which for me is tragic, because I had a lot of hope and expectations in President Hichilema. Now, I don't know whether it was wrong advice. I don't know what it might have been, but I think he picked a wrong recipe to bake this cake. And I think, I don't see how we can turn things around, Ambassador Mwamba.
We are celebrating a Diamond Jubilee, 60 years we've been independent. What did we do wrong in the past? What could we do better? And then what do we do in the next 60 years?
I think, again, one of the things that we need to do a lot of in this country is write history books, right? Because I think we need to start studying quite deeply. If I was in charge of, if we had a Zambia National Science Foundation, if I was in charge of it, I would say, let's give some grants to historians who are going to spend a good amount of time revisiting the past and writing books for us about the past. So I have a feeling we have done well in those times when we've been in charge of setting policy, really genuinely in charge. We have done very well as a country. And by mean very well, I just don't mean a few getting wealthy, but broad-based prosperity. And we've done very badly when we have ceded policy-making powers to outsiders. So I think that's the lesson for me. If we're going to do well in the next 60 years, we've got to be in charge. If we make mistakes, let's make them ourselves. So, okay, we made the mistakes ourselves. Let's pick ourselves up. But what I think we've done well in those times, when outsiders, when we ourselves have been in charge.
We're in charge.
And done badly when we have foreigners.
Because I admire having grown up on the copper belt, I admire the golden years of ZCCM, totally under our people. And look at the monumental achievements they made. And we even had spin-off, like, for example, for sports, we're the strongest then in sports because
the copper belt was the
hub of sports because the mines decided to invest in sports.
I mean, if you go around the world, every time I travel, I run into a Zambian working for a mining concern abroad there. You have a conversation with him, they'll tell you, or him or her, they'll tell you, oh, I'm a product of Mmembe, then from 6, and then I was sent abroad to Imperial College by ZCCM. And now I work. So ZCCM's achievements, I think, again, are incredibly underappreciated and understudied. But that's the lesson. We have done well in those times when we've been fully in charge, and done badly in those times when outsiders have been in charge. So that's I think, is the lesson.
And then to your fellow economists in the country, some under Economic Association of Zambia, others in the public sector that are crafting policy, just what are your words for them?
First, before we're economists, we're Zambians. I think that's very important. So when we're thinking about setting policy and crafting policy and debating policy, we should always think about that. This is not a game, right? Lives of people are at stake here.
It's not an ideological game.
No, it's not an ideological game. It's not a logical game. It's not a game of who's smarter than who. No, this really what we advise has implications either to lead to prosperity for most people or to pain. I'm slightly disappointed with my my economist colleagues, especially in this moment. I am very surprised to see that with the lessons of history, these people are very educated, certain have PhDs, have master's degrees. With what we know about the 1990s, I was very surprised to see that a lot more people are advocating for us to go back to the disaster of the 1990s via the IMF route. So I was very, very surprised.
I deliberately asked that question because every time I see an economist on TV, on radio, give their perspective, they are eternally hopeful. In fact, they gloss over the crisis that we're going through. They don't recognize that the country, I think, hasn't had this. For example, the cost of living crisis is the worst in the last 30 years.
Correct.
They live with our people. They know the pain our people are going through. But look at their glowing tribute to the president and to the economic policies of this country.
Correct.
And I said, this is reminding me of the 90s. Everyone knew that selling of these assets, they may not express it properly, but they knew this is wrong.
Correct.
This used to be ours. Now you're giving it away.
Correct.
You know.
I mean, it's very surprising. I mean, you're right. You're right. It's, when I see that, I'm also equally disappointed. And I've always thought of myself as an economist who best packages the arguments that the common Zambian man or woman are making. Often what I say, the common Zambian woman, mungalekema foreigners wabwera wachitavaso na so. This is what the common man or woman is doing. My job as an academic, as an expert, is to not turn that into theory, to theorize what the everyday person is experiencing and saying. But often my economist colleagues have been very elitist. They've often, I don't know. You don't know economics. Economics is very complex. Tilekeni is my expert. So it's been very disappointing to see. And by the way, you can still be very respectful to President Hichilema because he deserves that respect, the head of state.
Yeah.
But still engage with him, still criticize his policies. Not him, the person, but his policies. And I'm sure he too should be able to appreciate that as a head of state. Right? So just like in the PF days, most people say, oh, this guy is UPND.
Yeah.
I wrote many critical pieces
of
the PF government. But I was respectful to the president. Right? But that's, so it is, I'm very sad to see what has happened, I think, in my own profession in this country. In this moment that we're in, the quality
when we
of
need
debate,
your voice.
Yeah, the quality of debate has been very bad. The quality of debate has been very disappointing. It has lacked patriotism. I mean, for example, when you posted that thing about an evidence lab, a bunch of people said, what's wrong with this? I said, where can I start from in educating you that we got independence in 1960s? If you cannot see that this is wrong, then I'm sorry. And I've expected Economics Association of Zambia to take out a very strong statement.
Yeah. Because their members actually may not even have jobs, and there are jobs being created for foreigners.
Exactly. They should have taken out a very strong statement saying this is actually unacceptable. In a country that has a cadre of economists that number easily in the hundreds, if not the thousands, this is incredibly unacceptable. It is insulting, and it is also immoral. And we ask the Minister of Finance to reverse this decision immediately. Yeah, people were saying, what is wrong? Sometimes it's good to have outsiders to help you. Of course, they can help, but they cannot be in your bedroom.
No.
I mean, let's be serious about this. So I've been very disappointed, and it's been very lonely as an economist. But I'm always encouraged by the younger ones who are coming up. They always write me, because they can see it with some level of distance. Some of it is also very self-serving. Some of the biggest... Yeah,
self-serving is another matter.
Yeah, some
people are looking for jobs. Others want to look good in the eyes of government. Others have pay strings,
Of course.
They are on consultancy.
Of course. So,
there are many times I've called people to come and sit on the table and they say, Ambassador, still have a consulting job with these guys. And,
see?
You people politicians. I said, no, I'm sitting there. Yeah. Literally like you, we are discussing, I'm not partisan, we are discussing national affairs, perception issues. Correct. But Dr. Griff Shaila, let me thank you once again. Just give me your last words. I'm so privileged that you came and we had this discussion. I think this podcast will go far and wide because of the thoughts that we've now concretized, in person.
Ambassador Mwamba, I thank you for setting up this platform. I think when future historians write about this, and I'm not saying this because I'm trying to sugarcoat it, and they try to look at this moment, they'll look towards this platform and be amazed at just the level of debate and discussion and openness. And this is value adding. So I think I just want to reiterate and congratulate you for that. One of the things that's been lacking in this moment is this kind of
rational
discussion,
debate about our country.
Our newspapers are letting me down. Every time I look at the headline, in some of these newspapers which were doing really good investigative journalism before the election, all of a sudden they've stopped doing it. Big topical issues are no longer the headlines. They're buried somewhere deep there. So I think this platform is filling that void in that way. So my last thoughts are...
For our country?
I'm forever... I love this country. Every time I come back, I'm always amazed just at how much of a beautiful country God has given us. We have everything that we need. I live in a place, Ambassador Mwamba, that is a very hostile environment, by which I mean the sort of the country itself. It's a desert.
You live in a desert.
Desert.
You have no rivers.
No
but you have no
rivers.
load shedding.
No load shedding.
And you live in cool places.
Cool water always comes out of the tap. Electricity. I moved there in September last year. We've never had a power outage, and that is a desert. They don't grow anything, and yet their shops are full of food. Right? What have they done? They've used the one gift God gave them, oil and gas. They've used it to the benefit of their people. The oil and gas companies are owned by the government. That's the difference.
That's very important.
That's the difference, which was the difference under ZCCM. Like I said, we've done well in those times when we ourselves have been fully in charge of our affairs. So that's the lesson of the Gulf. So we have everything we need in this country. We're very much blessed by God. I wonder
so the
why.
foreign companies in the oil sector that we see in the Gulf and in the Arab world, what's their role?
I mean, they're joint ventures, playing very minor role. Often they'll come in as joint ventures. They'll be playing a role in those segments where the locals lack the expertise. Okay. That's what you do. Mm-hmm. You know, they might say, okay, for example, maybe the gas is contained in a very challenging geo-ecological zone or whatever, and for this we need a Norwegian company because Norway maybe has experience in dealing with this kind of gas, exploring this kind of gas. So we need a joint ventureship at that level. But after it's mature, we're going to buy these people out. So yes, foreign players arrive, but they come into those segments where the expertise are lacked, not in the basic stuff. You know, basically getting oil that is just in the ground or getting copper that's just at the surface. No. I mean, so that's also the lesson of Norway, by the way. Norwegian state oil company is called Statoil. It's owned by the Norwegian people. Statoil was established in the 70s when Norway discovered oil and gas. Statoil, because it's owned by the Norwegian, has been able to accumulate savings, Ambassador Mwamba, worth $1 trillion.
Yes,
for the benefit
they're one
of the
the
Norwegian
biggest sovereign fund.
We ourselves, and a Malawian economist who died, very distinguished, Kotandeka Mkandawiri, estimated in 2015 that if Zambia had never privatized the mines, they would have had, by 2015, a sovereign wealth fund worth $20 billion.
Wow.
What's the debt? Which is this external debt which all these creditors are making us jump through so many hoops? What is it, $14, $15 billion? Right, there you have it. So
Botswana is some good example too.
Botswana is also some very good example too, exactly. And you saw, I think there's a very famous clip that went around of the president there, really talking about some of these issues.
Because he's now wrestling marketing rights.
Of course.
You know, he realized, yes, they had a joint ownership, 49% with De Beers.
Correct.
Then he realized that they were making more money with the marketing rights.
Of course.
And he has now gotten 25%. I think in the next 5 to 10 years, it will increase up to 50%.
And that's the beauty of it.
And now they've even now gone into beneficiation.
Of course.
Where they want diamonds to be processed in Botswana.
That's the beauty of joint ventures. You learn. You learn about your partner, and then you adapt your strategies. Yeah. This is what China did. This is what we should have been doing here. Go into a genuine partnership, not just having some figureheads on the board. No, Zambia's representation on the board. You see the people on the board, they're just figureheads.
Yeah.
A genuine partnership, you learn in the way that the Botswanan government is learning. So I'm hoping, Ambassador Mwamba, going forward, we take charge of our destiny again. You know, we can run the commanding heights of our economies. We have our people who are patriotic running those things. This is what I'm hopeful for, and we can do it. You know, I mean, think about it. We've never had war. We get along very well as a people, in spite of our differences. We get along very well. You know, being back home has just reminded me of that fact. Given my experience in different parts of the world, just like you've lived in different parts of the world where nation building is very difficult. But we've succeeded here. We've built a nation together. We get along very well. We see eye to eye with each other. We don't resort to violence to resolve differences. So we've got a lot going for us, and then we've got these gifts that God gave us. Where is the missing link?
Yeah.
You know. So I hope we can sort those things out going forward, Ambassador Mwamba.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah.
Dr. Grieve Chelwa, Associate Professor of Political Economy at the Africa Institute. He's got immense experience. He was at Cape Town's Graduate School of Business, where he also directed the MBA program. He also introduced an inaugural postdoctoral fellow at the Center for African Studies at Harvard University, and is also a visiting postdoctoral fellow at Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research at the University of Witwatersrand, Wits in South Africa. He is well documented, he is well published, he has written many contributions to very international journals in his sector, and is someone we celebrate, and we celebrate every day. So Dr. Chelo, I'd like to thank you for coming. You're one of those people that our country should celebrate. We are one of those people that the powers that be must get in and consult on our policies, and to give confidence to even your fellow policy and other experts that are in government that are looked down upon and that are insulted every day by these kids they bring to try to advise us what we know. So thank you for coming, and travel well to UAE. When I'm coming to UAE, I will call you so that you can host me. You and your beautiful wife can host me.
You're more than welcome to visit us, Ambassador. It will be an honor. It's been an honor to be on this program, and thanks for your kind words.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, J Cool, and turn on the notification bell, cause I'm gonna see you in the next video.